It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 165, printed in Part A of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wyoming seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 165, printed in Part A of House Report number 118-216, offered by Ms. Hageman of Wyoming.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise today in favor of my amendment number 165 to H.R. 4365. My amendment prohibits the use of funds to pay regular remote and telework for the civilian and contractor workforce of the Department of Defense. Madam Chair, at the very beginning of this Congress, our majority brought the voice of the American people to this chamber, saying that enough was enough and that it was time for the federal workforce to return to work. To this end, we passed the Show Up Act because our constituents were sick and tired of the lack of service from the federal government. While progress has been made to some extent, there are still legacy and recent telework and remote work agreements that keep federal workers who are supposed to be delivering for the American people out of the office. This includes the Department of Defense workforce, which is allowed to work from home in varying capacities. In 2019, the Office of the Director of National Security found that across the entire federal government, 4.2 million employees were eligible to access classified information. The Defense Department is responsible for 3.8 million of these clearances. Of these clearances for employees of the DoD, 20% are civilian workforce and 26% are contractors. The DoD works largely in a classified setting. Its responsibilities are to safeguard this nation. How this mission can be fulfilled when the employees are sitting at home is beyond me. Madam Chair, it is time for the federal workforce, including those who work for the DoD, to return to work so the American people can receive a full and fair return on the services that they fund through their tax dollars. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Wyoming reserves. The gentleman from Hawaii seek recognition.
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm reading the text of this amendment, and it says here, none of the funds appropriated may be used for the purposes of teleworking or remote working for any employee or any contractor of the Department of Defense on a regular and recurring basis. That seems pretty excessive to me. Now, I would recognize with my colleague from Wyoming that certainly telework presents opportunities in some cases for abuse, just as regular work does. But we're living in a new world. We're living in a post-COVID world. There is a place in our workforce for regular work, quote unquote, which is not so regular anymore, and there's a place in our world for telework. I can certainly envision legitimate purposes for an employee or a contractor of the Department of Defense to engage in telework. For example, a particularly valuable contractor who does in fact choose to work at home, and that contractor's services are desired by the Department of Defense. Why should we limit the Department of Defense in its ability to utilize telework if and as appropriate? By the way, it may be not only about the efficiency of the work, but it may be more cost productive. It may be more cost effective for that work to be engaged from the telework perspective. We have the technology to do that. There are a lot of ways that we can provide for work. We're obviously in a significant recruiting and retention challenge for the Department of Defense, and if the Department of Defense wants to engage in telework or offer that as an alternative to satisfy its own needs, I see no reason to provide an excessive amendment that essentially rules out an entire option that is available really to the rest of our society. And for those reasons, I must oppose this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Hawaii reserves. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
I yield 90 seconds of my time to the chairman of the committee.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
I rise in support of the amendment. Regular telework was a necessary evil, to sustain DoD operations during the COVID lockdown, but that time is over. Main Street small business went back to work in person years ago, and big business is steadily ending full telework policies. Leaders across the country have found that full-time telework drives more meetings, reduces productivity, and hinders the development of new employees. Further, DoD personnel must also access and work on highly classified national security issues. I urge a yes vote and yield back my time to the gentlelady.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Hawaii is recognized.
To my friend and colleague, Mr. Calvert, Main Street small business is engaging in telework today. It is finding the opportunities to utilize telework where appropriate. Main Street government is engaging in telework where appropriate. I completely agree with the concerns for telework in a national security environment. Presumably, if one was exercising flexibility from a responsible perspective, one would not engage in telework especially in the national security area. But obviously, we have a great part of our federal government that does not engage in national security directly, and why shouldn't the Department of Defense have this particular flexibility? So again, the excessiveness of the amendment and the no exceptions at all nature of the amendment, I think, advise against it. I reserve.
The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you. I believe that my colleague on the other side misunderstands the amendment and the scope of it. The amendment does not prevent DoD employees from working from home if needed, such as for health or emergency situations. In fact, the Defense Civilian Personnel Advisory Service is responsible for policy oversight of the DoD telework and remote work programs. These programs are administered in accordance with DoD instruction 1035.01. This amendment specifically prevents only for telework and remote work on a regular or recurring basis. The other categories that accommodate health issues, emergency situations, and more would be left untouched, providing the necessary flexibility. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Hawaii is recognized.
Well, again, to my colleague, I'm simply reading the language of the amendment. On a regular and recurring basis, there may well be suitable reasons why telework would be advisable on a regular and recurring basis, which is not health-related and not very specifically narrow, as she has pointed out. We've belabored this point long enough, so I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman
And
from
reserve.
Hawaii has the right to close.
Yes.
The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
This should be a no-brainer that our federal workers and our employees should actually go to work. And in fact, it's actually bipartisan. President Biden called on his cabinet members to aggressively execute plans for federal employees to work more in their offices. The president and I do not see eye to eye on very much. In fact, very little. But in this instance, putting workers back in the office is common sense. This amendment would not defund telework and remote work for servicemen and women. This amendment specifically prevents funds for DoD employees, civilian and contractors. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves, but the gentleman from Hawaii has the right to close. The gentleman from Hawaii is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Suitable oversight of telework by the DoD is appropriate. It's something that we should engage in. But to foreclose it under all circumstances, I believe is unwise. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Hawaii yields back. The gentlewoman from...
One final comment. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentlewoman yields back. The question is on...
Now in order to consider amendment number 167, printed in Part A of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I rise to offer amendment number 167 as the designee of Miss Malliotakis of New York.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 167, printed in Part A of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. D. Esposito of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is September 27th, 2023, and because of the dereliction of duty of Secretary Mayorkas and the Biden administration, this nation is under siege. We have record numbers of migrants coming into this country, estimated at 10,000 a day that we know of, and an unknown amount of gotaways. In places like New York City, where people like Mayor Eric Adams and Governor Kathy Hochul have celebrated sanctuary cities, we now see, in fact, that they had no plans to be a sanctuary. They just wanted to pander. And now, in places like New York City, we have migrants who are coming into the United States of America through our points of entry. They're coming to the United States of America for a better way of life. They're leaving their homes, their families, risking their lives to cross this border. And instead of being given that sanctuary, they are in old hotels. They are in empty warehouses at airports. This amendment today will ensure that no funds made available by this act may be used by the Department of Defense to provide assistance to the Department of Homeland Security to house migrants or illegal immigrants or illegal aliens on military installations located in the United States of America. Back in May, Governor Hochul sent a letter to President Biden and CC'd members of the New York delegation asking that he allow military installations to be utilized for housing migrants. And just recently we've seen that there is a deal in place for migrants to not only be housed, but buildings to be erected at Floyd Bennett Field, a military installation in Brooklyn, New York. And not only is it a military installation, but like many others throughout this country, Floyd Bennett Field plays host to my brothers and sisters from the New York City Police Department, housing our aviation team, our scuba team, special operations, and many more. This simply says no funds to be utilized given to the Department of Homeland Security to house migrants and illegal aliens on military installations. I now yield time to the chairman.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I rise in support of the amendment. The Biden administration is failing our country and undermining our security with the unmitigated crisis along our southern border. This policy-driven crisis affects more than just the 4 states that share a border with Mexico, mine included. Today, every city in America is dealing with the influx of illegal migrants because the Biden administration has failed to secure the border and is unwilling to enforce the nation's immigration laws. The administration's refusal to act has created looming crisis at our nation's military installation, which should not be used to house migrants. They are not designed or equipped for refugee camps. Housing illegal immigrants on military installations negatively impacts our security and readiness. I understand that New York Democrats have created over 200 migrant camps in the Gentleladies District, in the Gentlemen's area, and I stand with them on the need for real solutions to the border crisis. I urge a yes vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose is the gentleman from Hawaii recognized?
I stand in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I just heard my friend and chair of the subcommittee say something that I completely agree with, which is we need real solutions in immigration to the border crisis, and that's true. But this takes a piecemeal approach that is unnecessarily broad and unnecessary in general. To our knowledge, there is no current or planned use of active military bases to support DHS need for temporary or long-term detention of migrants crossing the southern border, and certainly if the claims by my colleague from New York are correct, that's worthy of debate. However, the amendment goes much, much farther than that particular point. It says that the military cannot provide any assistance to the Department of Homeland Security to house persons on a military installation. And so therefore we have to ask the question, well, is that too broad in an amendment? Let's take a look at a couple of examples, or at least one example in particular. It would apply in that case to government-wide efforts like Operation Allies Welcome, which was the evacuation of Afghan refugees after the collapse of the government in Afghanistan in 2021. DHS at the time worked with the Department of Defense and state to use military installations to temporarily house Afghan refugees fleeing imminent danger and persecution. And this was a critical tool to save lives. There are, I am sure, other situations that we can envision in which we would want to access our military installations for very tailored purposes with congressional oversight, purposes that are under the control of the Department of Homeland Security. So if we want to have a debate over immigration, let's have at it. If we want to recognize we have a real problem, I'm the first to recognize that as well. But the amendment certainly takes a very, very broad approach to a problem that I think we can all agree is definitely a problem, and rules out many other situations that, in all honesty, we would want the discretion to the DoD. So much better off for Congress to retain that discretion to the DoD where necessary for national purposes with congressional oversight and with very tailored congressional restrictions. With that, I yield. I'm sorry, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized. For what purpose?
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to see that we're all looking for solutions to the failed policies of Joe Biden. But what we're focused on today is the fact that military installations, our national parks like Floyd Bennett Field, where military operations actually take place, they are critical to defense. They are not equipped to house migrants. That's what we are focused on today, that there are no plans in place, and that these plans, the ones that they're rushing to, are not the ones that we support. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Hawaii is recognized.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I think we're trying to confirm whether or not Floyd Bennett Field is in fact a military installation within the definition of the gentleman's amendment. But that point aside, again, I would say that if we're trying to solve the particular issue that my colleague and friend from New York is trying to solve, let's try to solve that one. But let's not do so with a blunt instrument that takes away discretion across the board for legitimate uses of military installation under congressional oversight, such as the Afghan refugee situation. So we can talk about this on the floor. Yes, it's completely necessary to discuss and debate this, but let's not overplay this so that DoD never has the flexibility to have any military installation used for legitimate purposes that we would all agree with. With that, I reserve.
Gentleman has the only time remaining. Gentleman from Hawaii has the only time remaining.
I'm sorry, I yield my time back.
Gentleman yields his time back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from New York and the gentleman from which the gentleman from New York has been carrying. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 168, printed in Part A of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 168, printed in Part A of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Norman of South Carolina.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, and a member opposed, each will have control of 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I cannot believe I'm up here having the debate, particularly at this critical time in our military. The spending of $1.4 billion in 2022 for money spent on diversity, equity, and inclusion. A woke military is a weak military. The military's sole purpose is to provide for the defense of our great nation. Our military's focus should not be the protection of the American people and our freedoms, not liberal feelings. Therefore, my amendment would eliminate any offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the armed forces and the Department of Defense. Woke ideology undermines our readiness in a variety of ways. It undermines cohesiveness by emphasizing differences based on race, ethnicity, and sex. We recently had 160 retired flag officers write a letter to Speaker McCarthy and House Armed Services Committee Rogers about the dangers of DEI and the opposition to it in the military. The officers wrote, "We respectfully request that Congress, pursuant to its constitutional powers, not raise and support armies and to provide and maintain a Navy, to take legislative action to remove all diversity, equity, and inclusion, otherwise known as DEI programs, from the Department of Defense." Another one, our military must be laser focused on one mission: readiness, undiminished by culture, war, engulfing our country. DEI is dividing, not unifying our military and society. Another one, we have fought for our nation and are sounding the alarm that DEI poses a great danger to our military warfighting ethos and is degrading warfighting readiness. Social engineering, commonly called wokeism, has absolutely no place in our military. And finally, these indoctrination programs differentiate service members along racial and gender lines, which runs completely counter to the military imperative to build cohesiveness based on common loyalties, training, and standards. What more, the Army missed its recruitment target by 25% in 2022, at this critical time in the history of this great republic. Otherwise known, this is a Bud Light level failure. And I would urge, Mr. Speaker, that this amendment be adopted in light of an administration that has completely left our nation vulnerable. And as President Biden told a group of overseas Air Force airmen that the Joint Chief of Staff had determined that the greatest threat facing America was global warming. The greatest threat was global warming. It's a claim that the Joint Chiefs had to walk back. He didn't mention Russia. He didn't mention China. He didn't mention the threat of the debt that's engulfed this country. He mentioned global warming. And as I mentioned, DOD spent $1.4 billion on their equity action plan. It's money we don't have. It just adds to the national debt. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman, for what purposes the gentleman from Hawaii rise?
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for
And
5 minutes.
before I proceed on the amendment, we have confirmed that to the prior amendment, Floyd Bennett Field in New York is not a military installation. Do we not value diversity in our military? That's the question in this amendment. Does it matter that we have a diverse military? Does it matter or not? Do we not value equity in our military? Does it matter? Do we not value inclusion? Do we want a military that represents our society or just a slice of it? That's the question. It doesn't, if you say that you value a diverse, equal, and inclusive military, if you say that that is of value to you, it doesn't happen automatically. It takes effort. And that's why our military leaders, over a long period of time now, have valued the investment in diversity, equity, and inclusion. They understand that a military that reflects the society that we live in values our military and accelerates and enhances and improves the overall service that it provides. They understand that that military in that situation will be supported by the American people. They understand that it will be respected around the world, where many, many other militaries, our partners and allies around the world, do value diversity, equity, and inclusion. They don't have these debates in their parliaments and Congresses. They don't face these attacks from an attempt to value these attributes within our military. We need to back those up. And that, yes, does take an investment. And where you think that those efforts are wrong, where you think they've gone too far, where you think that they are somehow affecting military service, then go ahead and oversee those efforts. But your solution is to cut the funding from all of them because you don't value these attributes in our military. You think that valuing these attributes leads to a weak military. I heard you say that. I don't agree with that. That's fundamentally not a position that we agree in and that we agree with. And so from our perspective, again, to take a blunt instrument and wipe out an entire department that values efforts that will improve military service, by the way, improve military recruitment. I hope the offerer of the amendment agrees that military recruitment is a major challenge for our military, and yet let's just say to whole parts of our society, sorry, we don't value you at all because we're not going to take care of trying to provide for diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's the wrong approach. And so just fundamentally, this is a difference in policy. It's a difference in goal. Apparently, it's a difference in assessment of what makes our military strong and will continue to make it strong. And so for those reasons, I have to strongly oppose this amendment. I yield. I'm sorry, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Speaker, this is just more liberal gibberish. $1.4 billion? Sir, you tell these young people behind me, you tell them instead of building ships, instead of building airplanes, instead of protecting cybersecurity, you going to really pay for transgender operations? Hogwash. You try to make that case to anybody in this room, and they would laugh. Well, it's so serious, they wouldn't laugh. Let me tell you some of the other things that I'm sick and tired of. Feelings. Talk to the military Gold Star mothers who have lost their children. Tell them what you just said on this House floor. An admiral told midshipmen at the Naval Academy that they need to read How to Be an Anti-Racist, a book that teaches the only remedy to past discrimination. Another one, military recruitment videos in recent years have touted the military's inclusivity to LGBT members. They use a rainbow flag. Enough is enough. Americans are tired of this. Why do you think the shortage of people entering the military to have to put up with this kind of thinking? So for this reason, we shouldn't even be wasting our time debating this thing. But it is what it is, and thanks to the Biden administration and their anti-military and anti-readiness, it's a time in America that we're in severe danger economically and security-wise. I reserve.
Gentleman's time has expired. Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from Hawaii is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, obviously, we have a difference of opinion here. And I would also submit that the leadership of our military have a difference of opinion with the perspectives expressed by the offerer of this amendment. Again, they understand the values of pursuing a diverse, equitable, equal, and inclusive military. They understand the challenges of a military that is not representative of the American people, and they understand the need to provide for that investment. So again, we can oversee this particular effort. We can question particular representations of that policy, but to take a blunt instrument to this entire effort and defund it and say that it has no value at all, That's what's objectionable in this amendment. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered from the gentleman from South Carolina. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 169, printed in Part A of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 169, printed in Part A of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Norman of South Carolina.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, like the other amendment I had, I cannot believe we're sitting here debating this. But what my amendment does is prohibits provisions of gender transition procedures, including surgery or medication, through the Exceptional Family Member Program. Now, let me tell you what the Exceptional Family Member Program is. It provides resources to military families with special needs. This program is designed for military spouses, children, and other dependent family members who require ongoing medical or educational services, such as individuals with autism, asthma, chronic respiratory illnesses, Down syndrome, and many others. The military has tried to politicize this matter. And my amendment ensures that we reserve the valuable programs and the dollars for these programs, which would go toward the intent of what it was put in for the first place, which is to help family with special needs and prevent the further disillusioned and misguided dollars spent on something like gender transition procedures. It also, my amendment also prohibits the change of duty stations simply for the purpose of providing a child with easier access to these procedures. I urge the adoption of this, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Hawaii rise?
I rise in opposition to this amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, we have an amendment that would want us apparently to occupy some other state of reality as opposed to the world as we have it today. And in that world, we do have transgendered individuals who need help, children whose parents are looking for the right courses of conduct for them. And this measure would say that those parents do not have the rights to make those decisions in consultation with their doctors and with their children. And further, what this amendment says is that those parents need not apply to join our military because they will not be welcomed there with the decisions that they need to make for their families. This amendment that cuts gender-affirming care options for service members' children will drive individuals out of the military, prevent recruitment to start with, and is frankly needlessly cruel. These decisions should be reserved to parents and their children. I hear all the time from the other side of the aisle talking about parents' rights all the time. Parents should have the right to make these decisions. Is there an exception for military families? Parents get to make these decisions, but oh, by the way, if you're a member of our military, you don't get to make these decisions. This is a very personal decision for parents to make with their families, with their children, and with their doctors. It's probably, in all honesty, unconstitutional, as courts believe health care bans like this violate the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. But let's leave that aside and just talk about the policy. Is the policy wise to say to service members and their families that they cannot access care that is provided to them in a non-service member world? I think that's the wrong policy. So I oppose this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Well, let me tell you the dollar amount spent for the past 5 years. $15 million. $15 million for surgery for a man who can't decide whether he's a man or a girl who can't decide she's a girl. Imagine that. And you tell those families that have children with Down syndrome, you tell those families that have severely autistic children, you're going to spend it for changing genders? I don't mind somebody if they're questioning the gender, but pay for it yourself when you want to have it, not on the backs of our brave military families. In the past 5 years, it was spent, the $15 million was spent to treat 1,892 transgender troops. Boy, isn't that something? You want somebody that's trying to decide if they're a man or woman on the firing line? That's really a question to decide in the military. 11.5 million was spent for psychotherapy and 3.1 million for surgeries. The price tag for individuals getting this surgery and treatments after have ranged from $8,000 to $100,000. Related health care coverage is only going up. So my point is, I think to make this argument, particularly with dollars that can be spent for meaningful, helping meaningful children who have disabilities, should be made, and to spend this money that we don't have just really spits in the face of our military families. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Hawaii is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, first of all, we can certainly debate the efficient use of our funds for expenses and the cost, but I strongly suspect that my colleagues' objections in this amendment do not relate to cost, but to a judgment about what should and shouldn't be provided to our military families. Now, we can have this debate about transgender care for our military service members, and the debate will look something like this one. But this particular amendment would ban any care for minor children. And so what this amendment would do is to say to our military service members, you cannot have the full range of recognized medical options for your children that are available in a non-military setting. That's what this amendment would do. This is about children. It's about parents making decisions for their children. And this is a situation where that decision should be left to the service member parents who have a choice as to whether to serve in the military or not, have a choice as to whether to join the military or not, or stay in the military. And we should provide to them the same basic rights and options as are available in the private sector. Otherwise, aside from not being fair to them, in my estimation, we also will not have a strong military because they'll choose not to join or to stay in. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman